Zoop, 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 zoop.
Hello, and welcome to episode 23 of the Who Cares Anyway podcast. My guest on this episode is James Goode, known to some for his role as Fifth Head in the band Faxed Head. But as we will hear in this episode, he has also done plenty of music and other recorded sound under his own name. Now, some of that, or much of that music is somewhat elusive in the sense that he, back in the 90s and into the early 2000s, was doing a lot, or at least a fair amount of music for very specific performance spaces. We talk about one of those pieces, an 8-channel audio mix entitled Spatio-Sensory that he did in 2003. But as one can imagine, that sort of thing doesn't exactly translate into the 2-channel stereo type of listening that most of us do in our homes or on our headphones, etc. But in more recent years, via his Bandcamp page, James has also been releasing more song-oriented or at least stereo-oriented music. Now, this episode actually connects back to a few different previous episodes in this podcast series, one being episode number 10 with Phil Franklin, another Faxed Head member, and another graduate of SUNY Purchase. SUNY Purchase, State University of New York, Purchase, a place that I've never been, but again, James, Phil Franklin, and a few others who we hear about in this episode went to school in the 80s. It also connects back to episode 18 with Christine Shields, who, among other things, mentioned a little piece of trivia that we get into in this episode, which is that James had, as a babysitter, one Cookie Mueller, an actress who I guess is best known for her work in various John Waters films. And that takes us down a little excursion into a pretty colorful childhood that I knew nothing about in terms of James's background. And then that, in turn, connects to a little bit of good family musical trivia, which is that James's younger brother, well, he performs in a band you might have heard of called Smash Mouth. I guess their original singer was having some issues and then ultimately passed away, but they needed a new singer, and enter Zachary Goode. And then finally, in terms of other episodes, Trace Bruins, episode 3, yet another alleged member of Faxed Head. And I will say that toward the end of this episode, we get into some actual behind-the-scenes discussion of how some of those noises and sounds on the Faxed Head recordings were produced. And I'll say that it is more detailed than at least I have ever gotten or heard in terms of how those sounds were made. And I think that covers it. And even if it doesn't, oh well, I think you'll still enjoy this episode. It gets a little bit weird, but what else do you expect given the circumstances? So with all that said, let's step aside and get into the interview with James Goode. Phil explained some things that I didn't realize, which was that there was a sort of a contingent, if you can call it that, from SUNY Purchase, but it might have just been 3. Or I don't know if you were you the first, or was Eric Mark Cohen the first, or were there others?
I think I may have been the first because I'd wanted to move to San Francisco since at least 1981 when we visited here, possibly earlier actually. But I remember in 81 we visited, and I just noticed how clean it was here and how people would actually make eye contact. And then there were things about San Francisco that I really liked, and things that I discovered soon after, like The Residence and Chrome and Tuxedo Moon. And I knew that George Kuchar was out here. I sort of knew him a little bit from SUNY Purchase because he came and showed some of his films, and I met him then. And I just, I knew a few people out here, and I liked, some of the music from those days. And it just wasn't practical for me to stay I'm from New York, and it wasn't practical to stay in New York it would have just been too expensive. And my father had moved. This was a few years later, but he moved from the loft that we had in Manhattan to the Big Island of Hawaii. So it would have been easy for me to just move back in with him and live in that loft. And I probably should have applied to Cooper Union because it was free. But my father kind of talked me out of it. He's like, "Oh, if you're still living in New York, you're going to college, you're going to be distracted all the time. You're going to be going to all these music shows and having the social life and all this stuff, and you won't get any work done." Which, wouldn't have been so terrible. I mean, my life would have probably taken a whole different trajectory if I'd stayed in New York. So, moving out to San Francisco I didn't know that many people. I knew far more people in New York. But yeah, I mean, that's the seeds were planted for me a long time ago, long before I moved. So I moved in '89 to San Francisco. And then Kathy Fitzhugh, who was a friend who Phil went out with at Purchase and was a friend. She moved out a few months after I moved out, and then she became my roommate. And this was like in about June of '89 or so.
Okay, and I don't want to get too probing into the childhood, but one thing that Christine Shields did mention, and I can't remember the name, but there was somebody maybe who acted in John Waters films who was a babysitter.
Oh yeah, Cookie Mueller was one of my babysitters. Yeah,
So
yeah.
was your dad in film or?
He wasn't in films. He was actually in one film. It was called the Cape Cod Piece, directed by this friend of ours, Stanley Taub, who was a plastic surgeon, a ventriloquist, a classical pianist, and a playwright. And he recently retired from plastic surgery, but he still lives in New York in a loft in Soho. And it's this low budget 16 millimeter slapstick comedy, and my father was the star of it, but he wasn't really in any other films. It was kind of like, it was a home movie at that time. This was around 1967. But in Provincetown, he managed a repertory movie theater. It was called The Movies. And
Good name.
yeah, really original, right? He would show, like the Marx Brothers, the Three Stooges, Orson Welles, Fellini. They showed El Topo there, Holy Mountain, a lot of stuff, and John Waters would show, Female Trouble, Multiple Maniacs, Pink Flamingos. Those films would show at my father's theater. Those were like the first places they would show outside of Baltimore, where Waters was from and where he lived. But then I think more and more he started kind of coming to Provincetown and spending more time there. And according to my brother, who ran into John Waters like maybe a year and a half ago or something, it sounds like he's still there quite a bit. Like he'll go almost every summer, or he'll go for film festivals, or my brother said he talked to him for a long time, and John Waters remembered us and remembered our father and all this stuff, all those times.
Okay, yeah, because I was trying to put that together. There must be some reason why one would have a John Waters actor or actress as a babysitter, and it's probably not just random chance. But so was he any kind of musician?
You mean my brother?
Your father? Or no, no,
Oh,
no.
my
We know
father.
about your brother.
Yeah, everybody knows about my brother now.
But
That's another whole story, right? My father, no, my father was never, no, he was never a musician. He was never a visual artist. He was a photographer for a while there. I think he was doing, I know, I still have actually a lot of his, or maybe not a lot. I don't know how many he took altogether, but some of the photographs that he took when he was a teenager and late teenager, like at that time, of Clark Gable, Myrna Loy, Gary Cooper, just various movie stars that would show up in New York, and he would be there, and take pictures of them. And I think part of the point of that was to get them autographed later on, perhaps. But I think it was just a hobby of his, and it kind of always was with him. And then later on, he got regular 8, maybe Super 8, movie cameras, and would shoot it's like home movies of us on the beach in Provincetown, things like that. He was really into classic cars. The first car I ever drove in was I think it was like a 1938 Bentley with a rumble seat, and he had that car in Provincetown and would drive between Provincetown and Brooklyn Heights, where he worked at a real estate agency.
I don't know the Northeast very well. Provincetown, it's a beach resort kind of town, or
Yeah, it's a beach resort town. It's the very tip of Cape Cod in Massachusetts. Yeah,
hence Cape Cod Piece.
Cape Cod Piece. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I was thinking, how does one get into, creating such average run-of-the-mill music as Mouthfeel or, Faxed Head, and it's from having such a standard all-American childhood with a generic upbringing.
Growing up in Provincetown, where like 15 or 20 years earlier, some of the abstract expressionists had made their home, and Norman Mailer lived there, Kurt Vonnegut lived there, all of the John Waters people spent some time there. Yeah, I mean, it was an artist community, really, before we, I think my parents moved there I guess in the early 60s. I was born in 66, and we first lived in Brooklyn Heights, and then when I was 4, my brother was born, and we moved to Provincetown.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you were kind of back in, but then you were back in New York at some point, or?
Well, I left, let's see, I left with my father we moved to LA for a year in the mid 70s. My brother stayed with my mother. And then after that year, I moved back to Provincetown, finished the school year, and then moved to New York, where I lived until college.
Okay. And then I was going to come back to you mentioned when I interviewed you, way back in 2016 out there at your place, how you were, you were one of the relatively small number of people who mentioned being into Residence and Ralph Records. I mean, relative to what people might think, like, oh, that's, but that when you first got out to San Francisco, you went out to 444 Grove Street, and
Right.
but at the same time, by the time you got there, Chrome, Tuxedo Moon, long gone. Residents, I don't really know what they were up to at that point, but
well, they still lived in San Francisco, I believe.
Right.
Because I don't know if I told you, because one of the first things I did was I looked up Homer Flynn and Hardy Fox in the phone book.
Oh, okay.
And they were both listed, and I called both of them and talked to both of them for long periods of time. Like, just, and they kept, every time I would kind of steer the idea that they were in the residence, they would kind of push back. And we would talk about something else, and we would just talk about the music, and it was never, obviously they could never admit that they were in the residence, assuming they were in the residence.
Right.
I'm still unsure. I'm pretty sure, but not 100% sure. But that was great. I mean, that was like one of those great kind of dreams of like talking to people who had kind of mystified and entertained you for a number of years, and then suddenly you're talking to them in person. It was nice. It's a nice experience.
Yeah, I had that. There was some guy named Fifth Head who I met once, but
oh, heard of him.
but you probably knew that. But when you got out there, or I don't know what you knew about what was like. Had you heard of, say, Carolina, or if not, how did you find out about it?
I heard about Carolina kind of just as I was moving out. This guy, Neil Martinson,
Oh,
who
right.
I went to high school with him, and we talked about music a lot. And I remember at one point early on, he gave me this list. He's like, these are records you have to buy. And it was like Television, Marquee Moon, Echo and the Bunnymen, Heaven Up Here, The Cure, Faith. You know, it was like it was a whole bunch of stuff, mostly kind of late 70s, early 80s stuff, because this was around probably 81 or 82. So he's who told me about Tuxedo Moon. I'm not sure if I knew about the Residents already. I certainly knew about Eno and Roxy Music and, you know, a lot of other stuff through my father, because he had, you know, Captain Beefheart records and Sun Ra and Moondog. I mean, he had tons of, you know, King Crimson. He had a lot of great stuff. But I forgot what you were. What was the
Well,
question?
I don't know. Like, well, you
You
know,
talking about Carolina?
there was what you knew about you knew about Ralph Records and earlier '80s stuff, but I don't know if you had any sense of anything that was, yeah, I
Oh,
don't know,
happening at
say
that
more current at that. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, well, what I was saying about Carolina was that Neil Martinson told me about Carolina kind of right as I moved out there, and he told me about Grux, and he's like, "Oh, I know this guy Grux. He's really eccentric. I think you two will hit it off. He has this band Carolina. You'll probably run into him if you go to any of the soup kitchens, you know, in the Upper Haight. He goes to those a lot, and you'll recognize him right away." And he kind of described what he looked like, and you know. And then I went to a soup kitchen and met him, and then we kind of became friends. This was probably in '89. And then eventually, I can't remember the first time I saw Carolina. It was probably in 90 or 91, around that time. And then I moved into this place, the Armpit Gallery in the Lower Haight, Hayden Pierce or Hayden Steiner, around
Okay.
there. And it was the bottom floor of a Victorian, and there was an entranceway and a bedroom on the right, kind of a narrow entranceway, and then a really big living room, just all open. And I invited Carolina to rehearse there, and I recorded a lot of those, and I still have the tapes of those. And then it's at some point Grux said, "Oh, we have this new band, this new band, Faxed Head, and we need somebody to play some tapes. Do you want to, do you want to do that just on a temporary basis?" Like I was on probation. And so that's how I joined Faxed Head, basically. I was just invited, and you know,
But you never joined Carolina, which was when you mentioned
no,
that you did they used some, or I don't know if you donated, or that's not the right word. You created certain things that they used on recordings.
I donated. I'd say donated because I wasn't paid for it.
Okay.
But it was, I think what I gave them may have been stuff I already had.
Okay.
I think so. Yeah, I think I can't remember if I said I have this tape that would be perfect for this one song, or Grux said, "Oh, do you want to do something on this?"
Okay. But it seemed like, I mean, that would have been a fairly natural fit in certain ways. But at the same time, I gathered that you weren't really, apart from Fax Ted, weren't really in bands.
Right. That's true. Yeah. Well, for years, Grux kept saying, "James, if you just learn how to play bass, you could be in Carolina." And I just never. I mean, I sort of learned how to play bass, but
Yeah, yeah. But
I guess I just didn't want to be in it. And maybe because I just wasn't crazy about the dynamic.
one could come up with the idea or form the impression that, say, play, what does it mean to play tapes, or that might have the idea that you were a non-musician, but then hearing your recent recordings, that's certainly not true. But what do you have a main instrument? Would it be keyboard or?
Probably keyboard. If you're talking about a traditional instrument, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm more adept at keyboards than I am, I think, at anything else.
But there is a lot of bass. I mean, I hear more bass than guitar, even on, like, a bass is a lead instrument kind of on some of your
I I
recordings.
I, I have nothing against the occasional bass solo.
bass, right. Or even having multiple basses going on at once. I feel like possibly, or different
Right.
tones of
I
bass.
have done that.
That
Yeah.
okay. And but my questions have been really out of order. I'm trying to picture, a lot of people say Phil grow up and they have an instrument like drums. I'm trying to picture were you more of a tinkerer or a recorder, doing recordings or making electronic stuff, or did you have an instrument back then?
Let's see. Well, when I was about 9, we lived in LA, and I was taking accordion lessons. So I was playing accordion, not very well. And then I took trombone in junior high school, and then eventually took drums, which I was terrible at, also in high school. But I would say that probably when I was around 8 or 9, we would have, I had a few of those monophonic tape recorders, the kind, the battery powered tape recorders with a little built in condenser mics. And I figured out how to, like, while pressing down the play button and playing a tape, you gently press down the fast forward or the rewind or the pause, and it speeds it up and it warps it. And then you can also make recordings that way, where you're holding down the play and the record and fast forward, and then talking into the mic or whatever you're doing, or get a second person to make noises into it. So I was doing that pretty early on. And then my brother and I were doing, like, skits and things like that, and making funny voices and slowing them down and playing them backwards and that kind of thing. So,
So it's fitting that you played tapes in a band, given that
right,
you could say tape recorder was your instrument, maybe
right.
something
It's
like that.
it's really one of the easiest instruments to play, assuming
Yeah, yeah.
it's either plugged in or it has fresh batteries. Even if it doesn't have fresh batteries, it still might work.
Eventually you went to Mills, and I'm trying to kind of piece together, did you have other musical activities at the time? Were you recording stuff at home, or were you plotting?
I started at Mills in '97,
Okay.
graduated in 2000. And I think during the time that I was at Mills, I didn't really do much with Faxed Head. I don't think Faxed Head did much of anything that I know of.
Chiropractic, I guess, was after that, or
Chiropractic was either 2000 or 2001. Yeah.
right.
So that was, I was spending a lot of time at Mills working on music. Actually, some of the stuff that I was working on at that point ended up on Exhumed at Birth, which was
Okay. So,
97. So,
right. Okay.
yeah.
But I mean, did you develop? I guess what I'm trying to figure out is when you went to Mills, you certainly didn't move out to the Bay Area to go to Mills. There was a gap in between, but were you developing something that you had been kind of experimenting with on your own, or
I was working on what I would call academic noise at that point, and I think a lot of people
okay.
were.
Right? Yeah. Okay.
More of an academic approach, more of a historical approach to electronic music. But a lot of it was based in computer music. It wasn't tape. It wasn't like, music. It wasn't music concrete and kind of acousmatic music. It was more kind of software based computer music with, Max MSP and Super Collider and just different software that would be kind of algorithmic oriented, as opposed to a lot of recording with, you know acoustic sounds. Although that's essentially what I was doing, and I never really embraced that approach with software.
That's what I was going to say. I thought you were saying you did that. Yeah. When I think of software,
Well, that's what we were doing. I would say that was kind of the curriculum.
oh, at Mills.
A
Okay. Is
lot, a
that
lot
people
of
like Chris Brown or some of these?
I took classes with Chris Brown, John Bischoff, Maggie Payne. Yeah, yeah, those were
Okay.
three of the teachers there.
Did you because I that stuff would trickle out. I mean, I was at through the college radio station where I was, and different things. I would come across these names from the Bay Area that would do these kind of improv shows that would be bean vendors or
Oh yeah, I
Berkeley.
remember Bean Benders.
Did
Yeah.
and that there was a heavy contingent from the East Bay was doing a lot of computer music and definitely academic noise, academic improv, if there is such a thing. Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to piece together is, that Mills College thing is something that is there, but it's across the bay, and it is a little different
Mhm.
sensibility. And you sort of, well, you literally did cross the bay, but you also crossed from the Grux underground music world to the academic world, and
And I've never been the
you've
same.
never been the same. But
Yeah.
well, were you? What led you to want to go to Mills? Was it you like, I want to do this specific, I want to
Well,
study this specific thing or this technique, or
I wasn't really planning on going, and I mean, I knew about it, but it was Willie Wynant who talked me into it. He said, James, if you want to go to Mills now, there's a possibility you can get an assistantship there and go for free essentially. And then you would just have to, teach students how to use various, like the recording studio, the Moog synthesizer, things like that, work in the kind of in their tape library, like transferring tapes digitally, things like that. So I applied and I got in, and I was there for a year, and then I thought I had the assistantship for the second year, and then they told me I didn't. So I was all despondent. I was like, oh, now what am I going to do? I already went there 1 year. I wanted to get my master's degree. And well, it was more the experience than the degree, I would say. It was, the people that were there, the facilities, kind of you know, the doors that would open because of just knowing people and going to shows and just, playing music with other people, which is something we all did a lot of back then. I mean, that was something I did a lot more of than previously. And then suddenly I got a phone call from Maggie Payne, and she said, "Oh, the one of the people that was supposed to go to Mills and get the assistantship can't go now. Do you want to go?" And I said, "Well, I guess. Okay, so I did. So I went for another year. And I did my thesis concert on, among other things, phylogenetic music and synesthesia in music and visual art and other subjects.
was that Braille's, or is that something different?
Braille's, exactly, yeah. Foment and the Braille's of Zupsia.
Zoopsia. Okay. First time I've ever heard that pronounced.
Well, Zupsia could also be pronounced zoopsia. And zoopsia are essentially hallucinations involving animals, which I don't remember if I made up or if it's actually a real word, but I was inspired. There was an episode of Gumby where there were these watermelon that Gumby had gotten from a farmer. It was like, no, they were magic beans that Gumby got from a farmer, and he planted them and watered them, and they turned into these watermelons instantaneously with a crazy like balloon twisting sound, like a balloon animal squeaking. They went. They were called Zoops. They were these mischievous, weird, amorphous animals that were basically the watermelons that had just kind of hatched from these seeds, and they kind of glided around going zoop 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 zoop, causing mischief. So that was something from my childhood that I always remembered, and I kind of integrated that into the title of this, what became my thesis concert at Mills. There are 12 movements to the piece, each of which is based on one paragraph of a short story that I wrote. And so each one of them kind of explores different conceptual ideas. One is more about synesthesia, one is about phylogenetic music or kind of evolutionary music, tying it into different evolutionary ideas, biological, zoological ideas, or just taking a very basic scientific or pseudoscientific idea and just kind of building something on top of it, just kind of as an inspiration. It's not necessarily scientifically accurate. It's just using it as kind of a starting point. So yeah, so it's basically 12 movements, but because the I mean, and this is true with other improvisations that I've done with with other musicians where they were playing off of a narrative score. Usually what they would come up with was so good and so amazing, and it worked so beautifully that I just couldn't bring myself to really control it too much. I just kind of let it go, you know? And so there was a certain point where I just had to stop doing this because I felt like I literally had no control whatsoever, because anything that was happening, I would be enjoying so much, and I'd be in the moment so much, just kind of waiting, anticipating what would happen next and not wanting it to stop, that these pieces would go on almost sometimes indefinitely, So remember, sometimes people would start walking out, or I'd get like dirty looks from people. Like it would be like an hour, and then like 70 minutes, and then 80 minutes, and then 90 minutes.
It must have been 2005 or so that there was that show, or I wouldn't really call it a show, event at the Pennsylvania house, the Pencil House, as I call it.
Oh, right.
Grandma's, yeah, yeah,
Jana's, yeah.
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 But and that was an 8-channel mix that you had done. But I don't know what that process is like, where you spend a lot of time clearly on making these mixes that can be heard only in very specific environments. And I don't know, did you do, how often did you do those kind of things? Because I mean, that was the only time I was present for one. But these
Well, I did that one piece called Spatiosensory. Was that 2003? I think it was,
could have
when
been
I
three.
first did it. So, I mean, what I did was basically I knew that in Jana's living room, I would have these 8 speakers arranged in this specific configuration. So I basically, in my bedroom, I set up the speakers approximately in the same positions, and then just compose this piece of music on a computer with a lot of MIDI fader automation, because I wanted to have every possible movement of sound from one speaker to every other speaker, like the possibility of doing everything in groups of 8. So I did a lot of automation where I would have one sound, and then I would duplicate it on 8 channels, and then go back, and I would use an 8-channel fader thingy. What are those things called? I actually have it right here. It's the JL Cooper Fader Master. It's kind of dusty, but
Oh,
so they're I mean, a lot of MIDI keyboards come with faders now, but it's basically just you you take one sound and you assign each of the 8 speakers to one of these faders, and then you can mix any sound anywhere in the sound field, like really quickly, as opposed to trying to do it by using a mouse, which would take forever, and
uh,
drawing the automation, which I still do for some
right.
things. But so and it's a long piece. I mean, it's like 50 minutes. So I had to do a lot of automation that way, with the kind of thinking of the 8 channels in space, and kind of how particular sounds would move through space. And it was all sensory. I mean, it was, because it's called spatiosensory, the 8 speakers reference ears, eyes, nose, mouth, so the different sensory modalities. So the sounds that I used would kind of move in particular ways based on kind of the sensory information that I was trying to communicate.
Okay, that's interesting, because I'm thinking about how, like, I have Xenakis, I think it's Legend of Air, that was an 8-channel mix that they had mixed down to 5, and you're taking 5 senses and spreading them over 8. There's a 5 and 8 thing here going on. But what is as far as the history of 8-channel music? I mean, was I know about Xenakis, or is there a tradition of 8-channel audio mixes, or
I'm
audio?
not I'm not really sure, and I never encountered the the way that I use the 8 channels, because I wanted the 2 of the channels to be basically embedded in the ceiling, or close to the ceiling, aiming directly down, because I had all these sounds, like liquid sounds and dripping and splashing and things like that, and certain electronic sounds that I wanted to literally, not, well, okay, not, maybe not literally, but the effect was that they would be pouring down onto the onto the listener's head. You know, I really wanted that effect of there being like the ceiling is kind of a field of sound, not just, normally you'd have walls. Normally you have like speakers that are approximately at ear height. These were directly above, like 10 feet above the floor, above the floor, aiming directly down, kind of showering down. So when certain sounds would come out of those speakers, it was kind of shocking, because it's like you were under a waterfall. But then you get used to it, and it just enlarges the space that you're in.
Yeah, I have very, very dim memories of that just being in the dark room.
Mm,
It's a while ago, but and then
right.
you did make it available as a stereo mix. I don't know what's involved in, or how close that can come to the
Yeah,
eight channel.
I've never been really satisfied with that, other than musically. I mean, the spatial element was pretty huge. So when I listen to the piece, just the stereo version of it now, it just seems like it's very wet sounding. There's like a lot of liquid in it, a lot of like slurping and dripping and things like that. And I kind of wonder if it's a little self-indulgent. And it's not, you know what I mean? Because those types of sounds were really meant to be heard in a pitch black room, moving around the space in an unusual way, dripping down from the ceiling, those kinds of things. So those dimensions not being there, it just kind of, I kind of, it feels like something's missing. But
Yeah,
I may one day go, even just doing like a 5.1 version of that might not be a bad idea.
5.1 is 5 speakers.
Well, it's technically 6 speakers.
Oh,
It's two, it's your two, your left and right. It's rear left and right, so surround left and right. It's a center speaker, which for film is usually for dialogue. And then the point one is a subwoofer.
uh, okay. I did not
So
know that.
generally
Yeah.
all your low, you're like the low frequencies, maybe some sound effects might be put in that.
Okay, because yeah, I mean, there was just a while there. Maybe it wasn't ever an ambition, or it just wasn't the medium you were working in, where um, there was like, here's this, all these people in Faxed Head have all these recordings out. There's this one does a lot of music, but doesn't have, you can't go to Amoeba and find recordings. But it wasn't the medium that you were really primarily working in.
Some of it was before the internet. I was putting things on SoundCloud when that came about. Before that was, what was the one before that?
MySpace, but
Yeah, MySpace. I put some music on there. I just wasn't really yeah, I wasn't really releasing CDs or vinyl outside of Faxed Head, or outside of other, people that I've played with who were putting out things. And to this day I still haven't really done that. And now I've gotten to a point where I'm just putting stuff on Bandcamp. I mean, I suppose if somebody came along and said, "Will you do a CD for me?" I probably would. I would love to do that, but of course, it's hard to sell stuff when you're,
right.
you know, I haven't played live in a long time. You really need a solid audience to do that, and otherwise you end up with boxes and boxes
Of
of
CDs,
product that you
right.
can't unload.
I definitely came across Mouthfeel through
Mm.
SoundCloud, and then we talked back then. But how long had those kind of, songs with lyrics and things like that been in the works? Had you been writing those all along, or
Let me think. I would say I mean, even when I was in college, I was writing songs that had lyrics and, bass drums, guitar, keyboards, things like that, although they were pretty crazy and chaotic back then. But I'd say maybe 2010 or so, 2011 maybe is when I started putting stuff together and just getting much more coherent and more kind of song oriented. I mean, I've always written I've written tons and tons of lyrics to how many songs I couldn't even tell. I mean, so many fragments, and
Right.
just a verse or just a few lines or just a title. So that process takes a while to kind of put a whole song together, which is I think why I'm doing more instrumental music now. Since
Uh,
Hardships on the Loose Coast, that was the last album I did where
okay.
where there are vocals.
Yeah, yeah, and it's a I don't know what you would even call it. It's a kind of one could say in big quotation marks art song, or I don't know, leader. I don't know, but it combines those recording techniques that maybe not 8 channel audio mixes, but these stereo spatial kind of effects with some sonorities that one might associate with progressive rock of the 70s, and that brings in Roger Powell. And I don't know, is that some sort of coming back to childhood, or
Well, my association with Roger Powell was through a a piece I did with two friends of mine who took, do you know William F. Nolan, who co-wrote Logan's Run? He was a science
uh,
fiction
yeah.
writer. It was a project called it was called William F. Nolan's Dark Universe, and it was 13 short stories that were adapted into these radio plays. And they used, and I recorded the actor. There were a bunch of actors came to my studio and acted out these stories. And then we had some people, well, actually, they wanted to use Roger Powell's music, this album that he did in the 70s called Cosmic Furnace, which unfortunately he didn't own the rights to. So they were really worried, like if they, I think like Warner Brothers owned the rights. And but we got Roger Powell to come, and Roger Powell was really into it, and we hung out with him, and he listened to stuff and all that. And then he really liked my studio, and he liked. I wish I could show you. Like I'd have to pick up the camera and kind of show you, but I have this wall. Well, you remember maybe,
Yeah.
like I have like three bookcases with nothing but all sorts of doodads and devices and different manipulated speakers and like artificial larynxes and all sorts of things that I've used in music over the years and doing sound design with as well. And he really liked kind of the feel of my studio. And so I asked him a few months later if he wanted he would want to come by and play. I have this Prophet 10 synthesizer that a friend had in storage. It belonged to his brother, and he said, James, you want to hold on to this synthesizer? So I took it. I've had it ever since then. I've had it for probably, God, I probably had it since around 2010 or so, or maybe earlier. So Roger Powell came by, he played like 45 minutes of just solos on it, basically. And I recorded it, and he also played some melodica, like really beautiful. He has a Hammond melodica, which has a built-in microphone and then a so then you have a direct output, and then you just play it, normally into a microphone. So he did like maybe a 3-minute thing, and then I worked some of the synthesizer soloing into the intro to Chew or Choke, which is on Mouthfeel, and most of the melodica ended up in a different piece on Hardships on the Loose Coast, on one of those songs.
And then the pulsars thing that's more
No,
recent.
that's more of the Prophet 10. That's
Okay.
later, but basically he gave me this just like this gold mine of kind of late 70s, early 80s synthesizer noodling, soloing, sounds that I could just kind of go through and say, okay, this little part here would be perfect in this song. This little part would be good for, something else. I still have some other stuff that he's done that's more like he did some stuff that was kind of more Baroque, almost like harpsichord, Baroque kind of, style. Some stuff that's more chaotic and kind of crazy. Some stuff that's more melodic. So I have, and then he gave me all of this other stuff too that he had done. I think he was working at EA, Electronic Arts. And that stuff is much kind of like more modern, like soft synth kind of stuff. And I haven't used any of that stuff yet, but I've just kind of sometimes I'll just go through when I'm looking for ideas. I'm like, well, put Roger Powell in, in a piece of music. Like, what do I have? What might work, or what might be an inspiration for something, a direction I could go in. And I do that with other people too. I mean, I've recorded a bunch of other people. I do that a lot with drums, where I have 4 or 5 people that I've recorded drums, them playing drums, and usually fairly structured. Like I would have, like this one guy, Miles Stegall, who's been on a few of my things. I did a session with him where he was basically improvising the whole time, but I would kind of give him, like, I had visual symbols for kind of directions that he could go in. And then I edited all that stuff and made all these different rhythms with it, and sped some of it up, slowed some of it down, multi-tracked it. So that became some of that stuff became some of the drums on Artifacts of Disbelief, which is one of the most recent things I've done. And that was like a big, like, that Artifacts of Disbelief, the second side, if it were vinyl, the long piece, that was kind of the accumulation of many different things, collecting sounds from other people, songs that I never really finished on my own, like kind of fragments of things that were very static, but could kind of take you to a certain place. And then something would change radically and you'd go somewhere else, or it would turn into just a drum beat, but there'd be tapes swirling around. So I was going for kind of the long form prog, or even kind of krautrock kind of style, but with a lot of other things happening in it, kind of more exotica, more music concrete, things like that. And my brother was saying, get back to my brother, he was like, I think you've invented a new genre. I'm not sure what you'd call it, or but yeah.
Stick your finger in the light socket. Stick your finger in the light socket. Stick your finger in the light socket. Stick your finger in the light socket.
And then with Fifth Head, which is I think one of the great pseudonyms.
I can't take credit for it. Grux made that up because I was the fifth member of Faxed Head.
Yeah, but it's kind of like that, like I get Alan Ravenstein and Perubu, or there's certain bands there would be kind of a fifth head figure,
Right.
whether or not they were the fifth member. But it's like, or and even that band Comets on Fire in the early 2000s, there was kind of a fifth head guy who just had the effects. They're not playing an instrument; they're up there with the band. But where did the mime element come in?
I mean, I needed a persona, So Fifth Head ended up being a purveyor of speed mime, and he also had a metal detector, and he would walk along the beach and pick up coins with his metal detector. And I think actually there may have been a few early shows where I was using the metal detector on people, like just kind of going up to people and doing that.
Now, did you learn mime for the role, or did you
Oh
decide
no,
that the mime could be used?
no, I never studied. I never studied mime.
Oh, okay.
It was all just, it was more like interpretive dance, I would say. I was kind of acting out the lyrics. It's kind of a combination of totally wrong American Sign Language and mime. You know what I
Okay.
mean? Because there was
Okay. Yeah.
like there were movements that were meant to be meaningful. They were meant to be expressing an idea or something. But it was also acting out like if you were making a balloon animal. So can you see my hands? They're just kind of,
Yeah.
so like
Right.
that could be thought of as mime
Okay.
if you were making an invisible balloon animal.
Okay. And so when you all went to Japan, it was 95, I guess,
Yeah.
95. I don't know, like, I don't know if you've ever been back. I've certainly never been to Japan or anywhere in Asia, but um, was there were there points at which you kind of said to yourself, "How is this happening?" Or did you just kind of take it in stride? Because that video, I mean, the video, the DVD, you see, this is a rather strange thing happening on stage, but there's a big
Mm.
audience.
They absolutely loved us. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. They were so enthusiastic.
It's one of those things where it would be hard to make that up, like that happening.
And what about the end of it? There was like the end of that video where
The
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 classroom,
classroom. Yeah, I mean that was really amazing.
you all were somehow invited to a classroom to do what? I don't know. Show what it's like to be in Faxed Head, or
I don't think we were invited. I think this was after
oh,
we left.
oh, okay.
We left behind McPatrick Head's head, which was all sweaty and dirty. You know
Oh,
the
okay.
helmet, the head, because we couldn't take it back. And this guy, what was his name? Matt? I can't remember his name. He had a fanzine, and he was a teacher at a school, I think in Tokyo or Osaka, and he exposed his kids to Faxed Head and told them the whole story, showed them the head, like let some of the kids wear the head, played them some of the music, and so they made this whole thing for us, this whole like big book with all these pictures of the different characters and kind of like a whole cartoon book, whole comic book based on Faxed Head. Like that was his lesson, that was like,
Oh, wow.
today we're going to talk about Faxed Head in class, and here's what they look like, and here's their, like as if they're superheroes,
Right.
and of course Japan, like there's like Ultraman and all these amazing characters, Astro Boy, so Faxed Head kind of fits in with that sort of, in a way.
Okay, so both you and Trey have certain recording techniques in terms of some kind of intense stereo or spatial effects that maybe there's a common influence. Did one of you teach the other, or did you all learn from a common influence in terms of how to record things like the way you record them?
I'm pretty sure that I taught him everything he
You taught
knows.
him everything he knows. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I remember him talking about a special stereo technique that he had figured out through some software that he was using, which was, I think, oh my goodness, what was it called? I don't even remember. This was in, let's see, the year 2000, I believe it was, when we were doing chiropractic. And he had software that he was using on his laptop. This was kind of right around the time that I started doing computer recording. But he was using a PC. So it was software that I'd never heard of. And he had some software that was kind of a fancy toolkit for music, kind of music concrete, electroacoustic music, using a lot of the like kind of software simulations of a lot of techniques that they would use, like Pierre Henry and Pierre Schaeffer used, and other composers from the early 50s on. And there was this one technique. I don't know how he did it, and or if it was just a preset that he kind of latched onto in that software. But it was this amazing stereo effect where the sound, it was stereo, but the sound would kind of would move outside of the stereo field. And it would kind of like, it was almost as if it was kind of in your head. Like it would kind of pop out, and it wasn't mono. It wasn't directly in the center, and it wasn't in either of the two speakers. He could kind of move it a little bit, just enough so that it kind of became, it was almost like a hologram. Like in space, the sound itself became this object that moved outside of the stereo field. And I have this device called a spatial enhancer that can do that. It's like this late 70s, early 80s home hi-fi component, and it does something similar. I mean, in terms of stretching the stereo spread so that the sounds seem to be happening outside of where the speakers are, where you'd expect to hear the sound coming from. But whatever Trey was doing was more kind of central. So it's kind of more like it was closer to your face, the perception of that sound, as opposed to coming from either side of the two speakers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would he do more of the actual recording of the Faxed Head, the setting up mics or that kind of stuff? Or
Yeah.
I mean, to help the band, of course, because he's not in the band, obviously. But
Right. I mean, I think we would all set up mics, but he would, usually, I mean, wherever we recorded was his studio, essentially. I mean, let me think. We did do some stuff at Mike Patton's house, not really at his house, but at a
the Shotwell,
the Shotwell
Bomb
studio.
Factory. Yeah.
I think he lived there at one time, and then he had these two buildings that were like really heavy duty sheds with big metal sliding doors that were in front of the house. And then one of them we recorded, there was a tribute to the Hanatarash that we recorded some stuff. And I think we recorded one of our singles there. I don't remember which one. Maybe Violence Gone and Spanish Rice, some of the early stuff. And then we recorded a lot of stuff at the Mr. Bungle practice space, which was then, I think they sold it, and like Ignorant Bastard Ale or something took it over, brewery. I don't know. I'm not sure if that was the name of it. So that, which was a shame, because it was tons of practice spaces in there. So, and that was out in what we called Kill Zone back then, out in near Hunters Point.
Right. Okay.
We recorded Exhumed at Birth there. And then we recorded Chiropractic in Felton, in Trey's house. So it seems like everywhere we recorded basically was like Trey's house or Trey's studio or Trey's practice space, that kind of thing. And then he would often do the most of the engineering. He would do the recording, and then some of the overdubs. And then usually he and I would come in after the basic tracks were recorded and lay down my tapes. Like for Exhumed at Birth, I brought in my 1/2-inch 8-track reel-to-reel, which I had tapes on, and we just transferred them directly to his ADAT. That was all ADAT. That one.
Okay.
Remember the ADAT?
See, I don't, but I remember hearing about it. I've learned about it. That was a brief period.
Yeah, you'd use a super VHS tape, and you'd get 8 channels out of it. There was one song. I don't know if I was telling you about this, but there's one song on Exhumed at Birth, Could Eckankar Help, that has a lot of tapes. And I was basically, Trey figured out sort of the rhythm of it, kind of the rhythm that he would have to use in order to record the tapes that I'm playing for him. So I would say, okay, I'd start playing a tape and he'd say, okay, ready, go. And I'd start playing a tape and then he would punch out and then I would go somewhere else in the song and he would bring that in again. And we kept doing that probably a dozen times with all these different tapes. And he was doing these incredible punch ins and punch outs where the tape would go and then I would be like tape manipulating something and I'd be slowing it down and then suddenly it would go to another tape which we had done, a few minutes earlier until we filled the whole section. Kind of the solo section of the song with all these tapes that kind of go quickly from one to the next. And he was also doing spring reverb at the same time and kind of making some things like explode with reverb and then become really dry again. And then a new sound would happen and then, big explosion of reverb again. So it was kind of like two music concrete artists working together, and like one kind of knowing the kind of the pace and like kind of where things go. And the other person is just kind of like playing stuff and just kind of letting it go. But like hearing, of course, the song at the same time and knowing like I have to slow this down a little bit here or speed it up or warp it, or I had all these techniques back then for kind of compromising the sound quality, I would say, like, I mean, a kind of a broad range of effects from really, really subtle to absolutely horrendous, like, like frequency distortion of a tape by like literally pinching it with your fingers like really hard so that the oxide is like all coming off, or it's like creating this really fast, like frequency modulation of the tape itself. Just like if you pinch, a piece of plastic tape, you get that like squeak.
Oh yeah.
You do that to tape, like magnetic tape, it vibrates the tape at whatever that frequency is. So it kind of like modulates it in a kind of a really ugly way if you do it really extremely, but if you do it really subtly, you get kind of gentler sounds. So I was doing a little bit of that, a little bit of like kind of warping the take up reel and the supply reel back and forth, slowing it down, speeding it up. So I was kind of trying to incorporate all those techniques, and then Trey was like structuring everything so that things would happen at the right time and nothing would, kind of cover anything else, and it would all fit together. And I just remember like looking at him and he was just kind of doing it in his head. He's like, he just kind of like, I could just see the wheels turning. He's like, I've got to do this 4 times and then 2 times and then 3 times and then 4 times. And then, so.
Were the source sounds, how specific were they to the songs? Or would it just be like you had some pool of noises that
to that particular song?
Yeah.
I think I just knew what sounds I wanted to use, and I knew where they were on the tape. It was all reel to reel, like, 1/4-inch tape.
What would the original sounds be? Just different things?
All sorts of things. They were like weird, like vocal sounds through a tube. Like a really wet kind of a sound through a tube. So you get this kind of weird flanging effect. or maybe that sound sped up, or the sound of a really loose street sign that I would kind of smack, and the thing would go dong 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 dong, or a basketball dribbling sped up would kind of give you a certain effect, or oh boy, all sorts of things. I mean, I had dozens of these sounds that I was familiar enough with them and just kind of knew that they would fit into that particular song. Other songs, there would just be one or two sounds usually. Sounds like Wyoming Hair. It would be kind of tape manipulated, toy electronics through massive reverb and distortion and other effects. Other sometimes a song would it was just really obvious to me what the sounds should be for a particular tape, just because a song like Wireless Rattle just needed to be very metallic, some kind of chain, zippers, Velcro, just certain sounds would kind of come to mind. And so
And then with live, would you then have to figure out how to get all those lined up?
Live, I would just use the tapes, and I would just have those tapes rewound to the beginning of the tape portion, past the leader, and just ready to go. And I think usually I would have two tape players, so I could have, like for Wireless Rattle, there was a certain electronic sound that I always used, this kind of, I called it laughing squawk. It was like tape recorder squawk, which is basically kind of hand capacitance feedback. You take the back off of a mono tape recorder tape player and do it with a battery so you don't get electrocuted. Ideally, that's better way to go. And you take the back off and you lick your fingers and you figure out where in the circuit you get feedback by using your fingers as kind of completing the circuit. So you're using hand capacitance to kind of mess with the circuit of the tape recorder. And so you get this screaming, hold on one second. I'll give you sort of an approximation of it. So that's a very crude approximation of what that might sound like. But so like Wireless Rattle, we use something sort of like that. And so I'd have that on one tape. I'd have kind of more of a tape collage of like a close up of a zipper closing and opening and closing, chains rattling, maybe cellophane crinkling, and then just kind of mixing in between those different sounds. Often I remember I would kind of go with what I thought would work in a particular song, and then sometimes it wouldn't work and I'd try something else. And sometimes I'd go through 4 or 5 different tapes until I would find something, and then that sound would sort of become my go-to sound for a certain song. Like some songs I just had no idea what I was going to do. I would just improvise and just kind of use what I thought might work. And, initially it might not at all for whatever reason. But then once I found that the right sound, I would then write on it with a Sharpie afterwards, this is for so-and-so song.
Did you ever ponder what the original, those French guys in labs, with heavy duty arts fundings who, pioneered these techniques, if they were to come across Faxed Head and the elaborate backstory that is in some senses almost like a fig leaf for bringing in these these sounds?
A fig leaf or a Trojan horse?
Not a fig leaf or a Trojan horse. Trojan horse is better. Yeah,
Fig
for
leaf.
smuggling in these sounds that I don't know. I guess it really depends on who it is. Like from Greg's perspective, not so much, or McPatrick Head's perspective, I should say, because he's more interested in the lyrics and the story.
More interested in the fig than the fig leaf.
The fig leaf, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then like, but Grux's noise making techniques. I mean, I don't know that much about him, but they were, I mean, came from a different place. It seemed like came from more like, I don't know, industrial.
His noise making in meaning Carolina,
or just kind of in general. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess there's no correct way to make noise or incorrect way to make noise.
I don't think I was ever there when he was making noise, other than just the usual noise that he made,
right,
in the world.
Right.
But I don't really think I was ever there. Yeah.
Many ways to make quote noise.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Just like there's a difference between music concrete and Merzbow. Obviously, I mean, or between some element of throbbing bristle or Factrix versus there's a lot more detail in what you and I tend to hear from you. It's not power as much as it is. Yeah, I shouldn't try to sum up all these things, because like what's on your recent recordings isn't very Faxed Head-ish either, but there's
right
a clarity and a detail to it that's different from like push this thing into the red kind of tendency.
Right. Yeah. I don't really tend to do that as much anymore. I mean, well, for one thing, a lot of the sound sources that I was using back in the late 80s and early 90s have long since broken. And I don't even really have them anymore. And there were very specific things that would make these outrageously atonal, like power electronics types of sounds. Some of them I still, like that thing I just played for you, that all that electronic stuff I was just doing a second ago. I do still have some things, but I'd say they're a lot more, they're easier to control than a lot of the stuff that I ended up using in Faxed Head early on. Like some of that stuff was really just tapes that I already had that worked really well with some of those songs. And yeah, I mean, recently I have been looking back at a lot of these old recordings I've had, that I've done, some of which I was thinking I might use in Faxed Head one day, but haven't. I don't really like repeating myself all that much. Although now and then I will, if it's something that really needs to be explored in a different way, I'll do it. But yeah, I don't have the same approach. I mean, I remember getting really, really bad headaches when I would be working on some of these tapes, because some of the frequencies are they're really, like really loud, really high pitched, screaming, shrieking, caterwauling, waves of distortion and feedback and dissonance that unless you're wearing like hearing protection the whole time, which would make it a little difficult to hear what you're doing, you're going to get a headache. And I think at a certain point, I just didn't want to do that anymore. So I figured out ways to kind of improve the signal to noise ratio and just not, I kind of felt like I'd done enough in that realm. It's very, very punishing. Musical sandwich. Go ahead, take a bite. It was made with your tongue, teeth, and taste buds in mind. The toxins are expelled through gelatin chimneys, conveniently placed
in the heel and the arch. There's no tar or asbestos, carbon, sulfur or methane. The sultanas are real. The fromage woman made. Mouthfeel, mouthfeel, mouthfeel. Musical omelet. Treat yourself to a plate. Rich milk on the menu. Notated for bass and treble clef. The eggs come from a factory where they're grown from seed, formed in molds extra utero, pale albumin, bright yolk. The fat, protein, and cholesterol have all been removed. All that's left is a thick starch, layers of gray and orange. Mouthfeel, mouthfeel, mouthfeel. Musical souffle, feel it rise in your lungs, fills your heart with despair as it rings out the sponges of moist vocalization, of warm gas in the air, of shrill pungent aromas we're unable to sense. We all rise in the morning and fall late in the day as a scale or a single note welcomes itself, expresses itself, welcomes itself, expresses itself, welcomes itself, expresses itself, welcomes itself, expresses itself.